Chapter 5. As chaos overtook Serum, Achilleos' first thoughts were not for himself, nor even for Odyssian. Rather, they were for Cerinthia, caught in the open like so many others. The hunter dodged a spinning wagon wheel and what appeared to be the remains of a scarecrow on a cross as he rushed toward Cyrus's daughter. From further away came a shout. Achilleos sighted the traitor also running toward her. However, having stood nearer the hunter, Cerinthia did not notice Cyrus, nor could she hear her father. At that moment, a massive fragment of roof suddenly tore off the guard headquarters. It fluttered in the air like a gigantic black bird suffering its death throes, then dropped with all the accuracy of an executioner's axe toward the unsuspecting Cyrus. Achilleos shouted, but, as with the traitor, could not be heard over the gale. A chill coursed through him. The hunter knew that there was only one choice left to him. The moment that he could, Achilleos leapt for Cerinthia. He tackled her much the way he would have game seeking to escape one of his snares. The archer did not care. All that mattered was keeping the traitor's daughter from witnessing the horrible scene to come. There was nothing he could do for Cyrus, who was too far away. But, although he managed to smother her view, Achilleos could do nothing for his own. He watched in macabre fascination as the piece of roof caught Cyrus from behind. The force with which it had struck the back of the man's neck ensured that there would be no hope for him. Indeed, the sharp edge severed bone and flesh with awful ease, and despite the fact that he could not hear anything but the wind, the veteran hunter knew exactly what Cyrus's horrific beheading sounded like. The rest of the broken piece collapsed atop the mangled body immediately afterward, thankfully obscuring it from sight. Cerinthia chose that moment to finally struggle free. She looked up at Achilleos, her expression one of surprise, and perhaps a little embarrassment, if her reddening cheeks were any sign. Achilleos suddenly felt very uncomfortable, and not merely because of having witnessed the fate of her father. "Let me up, please," she called, her voice barely audible. "Have you seen Odyssian?" The hunter's own embarrassment grew. Unaware of Cyrus's tragic end, her first thoughts naturally went to the farmer and no one else. Certainly not Achilleos. Still, her concern for the farmer gave him a momentary reprieve from telling her what had just happened. Now was not the time for Cerinthia to know. Besides, if she tried to uncover her father's body in the midst of this insane weather, it was very possible that she would merely end up joining him in death. "I saw him run toward the smithy," he finally shouted in response to her question. Despite his powerful lungs, Achilleos had to repeat himself before the traitor's daughter understood. He pulled her to her feet, careful to avoid tumbling her in the direction of the grisly sight. "Hold my hand tight or you might be blown back." To his relief, Cerinthia obeyed without question. Achilleos dragged her in the direction he had last seen his friend, the violent wind buffeting him as hard as any wild boar. He did not know what they would do if and when they actually located Odyssian. The farmer was considered a prisoner, a possible murderer in the eyes of some, and Achilleos' duty should have been to either convince his friend to return and face justice, or, failing that, force him to do so. But the hunter had already seen enough of what passed for justice, and the very thought of turning Odyssian over to the inquisitors, or even Tiberius, left Achilleos cold. More important, if he brought Odyssian back to Serum to face the charges, the archer had no doubt that he would forever blacken himself in the eyes of Cerinthia. They raced for the edge of the village, even as others ran past them in different directions. Planks tore off of buildings, adding to the dangerous debris flying about. A water bucket ripped from the village well smashed against the chest of one of Tiberius' men, sending him falling on his back. Achilleos wanted to stop by the supine form to see if the other still lived, but feared that to do so would endanger Cerinthia. With much relief, he plunged Cyrus's daughter and himself into the woods. His attuned senses immediately noticed the difference between the weather there and the mad turbulence in Sarum. It was almost as if he had shut a door behind him. The foliage barely shook, and the howling had all but ceased. Despite that, the hunter did not slow until the two of them were well away from the village's edge. Only then did Achilleus pause near a tremendous oak, and that more for his companion's sake than his own. "Are you all right?" he immediately asked her. Gasping for breath, Cerinthia nodded. Her gaze shifted around the woods, seeking. "We'll find him, Sari," he muttered, a little put out after having helped her escape the chaos. Then Achilleus recalled Cyrus and guilt overwhelmed him. "I wonder if," the trader's daughter began, halting abruptly as an unexpected hush filled the area. The two glanced back at their home. The lightning had ceased striking, and the wind there died down too. Most astonishing, not only were the clouds thinning, but it actually looked as if the sun was already trying to peek through. "Praise be! A miracle!" uttered Cerinthia. Achilleus, on the other hand, felt a peculiar dread inside of him, a sensation he had experienced but one other time, when he had first touched the ancient stone. Cerinthia took a step back to Sarum, but the hunter pulled her deeper into the woods. "Odyssian," he reminded her, though the farmer was not now entirely his reason for wanting to be away from the village. "This way, remember?" The trader's daughter nodded. Once more a look of determination across her beautiful face. Achilleus wished just once that such an expression would be reserved for him. Although he knew that he had seen Odyssian heading toward this part of the woods, Achilleus found tracking his friend much more troublesome than he would have expected. Odyssian had barely left any trace of his passing. In fact, the hunter had to guess half the time, for the farmer apparently moved through the woods with greater stealth than any animal. If not for the certain sense within Achilleus, the sense that he had never mentioned to others, but that always gave him the advantage when seeking a quarry's spoor, then it would have been impossible to keep after Odyssian. And that sense, that knowing that enabled Achilleus to ever follow the correct trail, also told him someone else had met Odyssian in the woods. It was not a familiar trail, and from its light touch, he suspected it to be that of the noblewoman. Who else? Whatever cloaked Odyssian did so for her as well. Her trail was even harder to maintain focus on than the farmer's. For some reason, that made Achilleus think of the stone again. Since he had discovered it, strange and unsettling things had kept happening, some of them undeniably unnatural in his eyes. Achilleus recalled the symbols and wondered if, with time, Mendel could translate them. Mendel was clever. Perhaps he could even explain the terrible storm and what... The hunter paused in his tracks, causing Cerinthia to stumble into him. He looked behind them, thinking that there was someone back there. Cyrus's daughter also looked. "What is it?" "Nothing." He tugged her forward again. Achilleus could not go back from Mendel. Odyssian's brother would have to fend for himself. Surely, wherever he was safe. The archer could not even recall seeing him when Odyssian had been brought out before brother Achilleus. "He can fend for himself," Achilleus repeated to himself. "Mendel's very clever, very learned. I have to worry about Sari. I have to find some way to tell her about father. Maybe when we find Odyssian. Maybe then, yes. Mendel will be fine in the meantime." The hunter kept on repeating the last in his head, hoping that eventually he would believe that scholarly Mendel would indeed stay out of trouble. Hoping, but not expecting. Mendel had arrived at the outskirts of the village just as it seemed that the skies had declared war on his people. In contrast to the rest of Starum's inhabitants, he had stood where he was, watching in fascination as nature acted in a manner entirely contrary to what he knew to be correct. Storms did not without warning strike so particularly. Wind did not blow with tornadic strength within village limits, only to all but die at his very feet. Only when the phenomenon had, without warning, ceased did Mendel stir himself and enter Sarum. The village center was in ruins, and more than one person lay still on the ground. The enormity of what had taken place began to sink in, and so did the fact that it had proven most timely for Odyssian. That last point was further emphasized for Mendel as he passed the burnt carnage that he somehow knew was all that remained of the robed figure he had recognized as a high cleric at the Cathedral of Light, a master cleric, from the looks of him. The fearsome bolt had left little, and the stench should have sent Mendel retreating. Yet some morbid fascination drove the younger son of Diomedes toward the ghoulish corpse. But as he came within arm's reach, a violent sensation akin to a hard fist struck him full force. Mendel staggered back, and had the unnerving feeling someone was screaming fiercely at him. He continued retreating, suddenly not wanting to be anywhere near the burnt remains. Then someone cried from behind him. "Where is she? I can't find her! I can't find her!" Mendel turned at the voice and saw no one. Frowning, he gave up and started away in search of his brother. "Good Mendel, have you seen her? Have you seen my daughter?" Out of the corner of his eye, Mendel saw a figure standing near a huge piece of torn roof littering the ground. However, as he turned, the figure seemed to vanish, or was never there in the first place. But he thought he had recognized who it was. "Master Cyrus?" he called hesitantly. "Master Cyrus?" There came no answer, but again Mendel was filled with a compulsion, this time to approach the wreckage from the roof. As he neared, he sensed something beneath the wood. Reaching down, Mendel tugged at the rubble. The wood proved even heavier than he had imagined, but, by choosing to use his mass to slide it toward him, Odyssian's brother managed to make some progress. Slowly, what had been hidden was revealed to the light. At which point Mendel let out a garbled cry and let the wreckage loose. He shook his head, a dismay he had not felt since the death of his parents, and siblings rising up to overwhelm him. And yet, at that moment, the familiar voice again asked, "Where is she? Where is my Cerinthia?" Only then did Mendel realize that the voice was in his head. Trembling, he retreated from the roof fragment and that which it had shrouded. A sharp point caught him in the small of his back. He started to turn, only to be seized roughly by more than one pair of powerful hands. The stern face of an inquisitor guard came within inches of his. "You!" barked the figure. "You are kin to the accused heretic in murder, Odyssian Diomedes? Admit it! Someone identified you earlier as his brother." Still struggling to comprehend what had just happened before, Mendel mutely nodded. Unfortunately, that proved to be his captor's cue to drag him through the village toward where a group of locals stood pensively eyeing 4 other inquisitor guards watching over them. Mendel estimated nearly 20 people in the group, their wide eyes and movement reminding him of a herd of sheep heading to the slaughter. Dorius stood arguing with one of the minions of the cathedral. Of Tiberius, there was no sign. A few of his men stood near Dorius, but they looked uncertain as to what to do, if anything. "But you've no right to be holding these good people," the headman insisted. "Under the authority granted by the signed agreements between Kajan and the cathedral, we have what right we need or desire," responded the lead guard haughtily. To Tiberius's men he added, "And in the scope of that, authority of your captain is ceded to us. You will obey all orders of the cathedral, and the first is to remove your headman to his quarters and confine him there." One of the locals put a tentative hand toward Dorius. "What should we—" "I won't budge," insisted Dorius. "Then, if these will disobey, I will have no choice but to have some of my own deal with you, and them afterward." The headman glanced at the fearsome warriors, then at his own guard. Shaking his head, he reluctantly turned and led the latter away. With Dorius's retreat and Tiberius's absence, Mendel now suspected that the captain was one of those struck down. The fate of Odyssian's brother and the rest of those gathered was squarely in the hands of the cathedral's inquisitor guards. Mendel did not exactly share his siblings' loathing of the sect, but at the moment he could think of no worse fate for any innocent than that awaiting him now. The warriors were likely to think of this as some act of magic, a notion that even Mendel could not entirely rule out. Certainly no reasonable explanation worked. "Move into the circle," growled one of those who had captured him. Mendel stumbled toward the others. Those nearest immediately shunned him, pressing against their fellows in their fear. Even those who had known him since childhood looked at Mendel as if he were some sort of pariah, or rather, the brother of one. "That's him," said the same guard who had shoved the younger son of Diomedes forward. Mendel turned to face a guard who, although he was a couple of inches shorter than the farmer, stared down the ladder with ease. The broad, rough-hewn face looked more appropriate on a brigand than a representative of a holy order. "The brother of the heretic and sorcerer, are you?" demanded the lead guard in a tone that indicated no response from Mendel was necessary. "Where is Odyssean, old Diomed? Answer now, and you may be spared his fate." "Odyssean's done nothing." "His guilt is proved, his mastery of arts foul unquestionable. His soul is lost, but yours may yet receive absolution. You have but to give him up to us." The words sounded absurd to Mendel, but the guard clearly believed everything that he said to the brother, despite the fact that he would be condemning himself. Mendel did not hesitate to shake his head. "We will begin with you then, and the rest here, all known to have fraternized with a heretic, will learn from your example." Just as quickly as they had tossed him in among the others, the guards then pulled Mendel out. They dragged him into an open space. As the farmer was forced down on his knees, he saw the lead guard stride over to his horse, there to remove a long, braided whip, rolled up and attached to the saddle. The guard undid the loop binding the whip, enabling the full length of the sinister weapon to flow free. He tested the whip once, the crack it made shaking Mendel worse than the harshest thunder. Face resolute, the lead guard headed back to Mendel, who squeezed his eyes tight and prepared for the agony. It was a coincidence, that was all, a coincidence. But as Odyssean stared toward Sarum, a niggling doubt ate away at him from within. He recalled again how terrible Lilia's ankle had looked, and then how unmarred it had appeared but moments afterward. There was the horrific storm that had assailed the village just as Brother Machilius had begun condemning him. What were the odds of lightning striking so perfectly? A coincidence, Odyssean told himself again, no more. Yet, even he was not entirely convinced of that. The farmer continued to stand there, unable to decide what to do. Then, a face came unbidden into his thoughts, a face he knew all well as his own. Mendel's, and with it came a sense of urgency, of impending threat. With a wordless cry, Odyssean started back toward Sarum. "Odyssean!" called Lilia. "What is it?" "My brother, Mendel!" was all he could say. The need to reach the village before something terrible happened to Mendel took over. Odyssean did not question how he knew that his brother was in danger. All that mattered was preventing Mendel from coming to harm, even if it meant being recaptured. Without warning, figures appeared before him. Odyssean prepared himself for a struggle, then recognized Achilleos and Cerynthia. "Odyssean!" blurted the trader's daughter. "Praise be that you are all right." The archer, too, started to speak. But, despite being glad to see them, Odyssean did not slow. He sensed time was running out. Without apology, the farmer shoved past the pair, each frantic beat of his heart a scream to hurry faster. The edge of the village came into sight. His hopes rose. But then, from further, an echoed a sharp, cracking sound, that sent a shock of pain through Odyssian's heart. Gritting his teeth, his breath now coming in pants, the son of Diomedes charged into Sarum. The sight that met his gaze filled him with loathing and anger. He saw many of his fellow villagers herded together like cattle, their expressions fear and confusion. Grim Inquisitor guards pointed weapons at them. But worse, so very much worse, was what the villagers watched. Near the ruined well, the lead Inquisitor guard had Mendel on his knees. Another armored figure made certain that Odyssian's brother could not rise. Something had torn open the back of Mendel's tunic, and now a long, red ribbon decorated the latter's spine. A red ribbon made by the long, scaled whip of the lead guard. The officer at last noticed Odyssean, then readied the whip for another strike. "Surrender yourself, Odyssian old Diomed, or you will force me to cause your brother more suffering." His twisted words, insisting that it would be Odyssean's fault if Mendel was again whipped, only made the farmer more furious. He wanted to lash out at them the way that they dared lash out at his brother. The length of the officer's whip curled up in the air as if blown by some sudden gust of wind. Startled, he tugged at it, trying to bring it down, but the sinewy cord instead tangled around his neck. He reached to pull it off, but the whip suddenly tightened. The officer's eyes went wide, and he let go of the grip in order to tear at the whip with both hands. A hacking sound escaped him. The guard nearest Mendel rushed to aid his commander, at the same time working to sheath his own weapon. However, his hand suddenly turned, causing the blade to rise above the sheath. Somehow, the blade bent and buried itself upward, just beneath the breastplate. Blood spilling over his hands, the stunned guard collapsed into the officer, whose eyes bulging as he now clawed in desperation at the macabre noose. The wounded guard finally slumped next to Mendel, who stumbled away in shock. A second later, the officer let out a last gasp and joined his companion. The whip remained tight around his throat. "Odyssian!" called Lilia from somewhere behind him. "But where are the others?" He glanced to the side to see the remaining Inquisitor guards converging on his position. A part of Odyssian wanted to flee, but his fury still dominated. He glared at the armed men who terrorized in the name of their holy sect. One man stumbled. His sword arm turned. The edge of his blade expertly cut through the throat of the guard next to him. The second man let out a gurgle and fell. As he did, he dropped his own weapon, which somehow tangled the feet of another guard. That man spun around, then hit the hard ground skull first. There was an audible snap, and the Inquisitor stilled, his head now lying at an awkward angle. But now the rest of the guards surrounded Odyssean, who eyed them as he would the vermin that sought to devour his crops. In his mind, they were no more than that. The farmer recalled when once he had discovered a cache of grain infested with such. He had done the only thing that he could to keep the creatures from spreading. He had burned the cache, burned it with the vermin still inside. Burned them. The foremost guard cried out. He dropped his sword and stared in horror at his hand, which was blackening before the eyes of all. In but a single breath, the flesh cindered, and the muscle and sinew turned to ash. Even the bone darkened and darkened until nothing remained. And as he befell the fate of his hand, the guard himself suffered so. His fate shriveled, and his body shook, even as his armor tarnishing, as if tossed into a coal-fueled inferno. He screamed, but his scream was cut off as his tongue crumbled. The eyes vanished then, melting into the sockets with a horrible finality. The crumbling black figure collapsed in a heap of bones that further smoked away to dust. His comrades had no time to gape in fear at his fate, for they perished at the same time. Their brief cries were shrill, and their deaths were marked by the clatter of empty armor and lost weaponry. Only after they were all dust did Odyssean return to his senses. and stare at a monstrous sight he could not even at that point fully link to himself. Yet, neither could the farmer deny the fiery urge that had swept through him, the urge he had focused on the hapless men. An unnatural silence filled Sarum. Odyssian finally tore his gaze from the macabre remains and looked at his brother, who stood but a few lengths from him. Panting, still obviously in some pain from the harsh lash of the whip, Mendel gaped at his older brother. "Odyssian," he finally succeeded in whispering. But Odyssian now looked past Mendel to where the rest of the villagers still stood packed together, even though their captors were all dead. He saw no relief in their eyes, but only what the farmer recognized as dread. Dread of him. Murmuring arose from within the group. When Odyssian stretched forth a hand toward them, they moved as one away from his touch. That, in turn, caused Odyssian to retreat a step. He looked around and saw that others had stepped out from hiding. Faces he had known all his life now eyed him, as the former prisoners had. "I didn't do anything," he murmured, more to himself than others. "I didn't do anything." The son of Diomedes protested louder. But the people of Sarum saw him differently. He knew. They now believed that he had slaughtered both missionaries. How could they not? Before their eyes, one man had been struck by lightning, another strangled by his own weapon, and the rest brought down in manners no one could ever claim ordinary. Odyssian spotted Tibian. He stepped toward the owner of the boy. The old man had been near a father to him as anyone since the death of Diomedes. Tibian could at least see sense. The stout figure backed away, his stony expression not entirely hiding the revulsion and anxiety. He mutely shook his head. Someone tugged on his sleeve. Mendel. Wincing from pain, his brother whispered, "Odyssian, come away from here, quickly." "I've got to make them see sense, Mendel. They can't possibly believe. They believe. I think even I believe. That doesn't matter. Look around. You're not Odyssian to them anymore. You're the fiend that the cathedral's master inquisitor claimed you to be. That's all that they see." Brow wrinkled tight, Odyssian glanced from one direction to another. All he saw were the same dark emotions. Dorius reappeared, and with him, Tiberius. The captain had his arm in a sling, and there was a gash on his right cheek. Behind the pair came the men who had been ordered to lock up the headman in his own quarters. Captain Tiberius was the one who finally spoke to Odyssian. "Keep perfectly still. Don't do a damn thing, Odyssian, except put your hands behind you." "I'm not the cause of all this," the farmer insisted, knowing all the while that his protests were as futile as ever. "You just have to listen to me." "There are archers positioned," Dorius anxiously interrupted. "Please listen to reason, Odyssian." The farmer shook. No one would listen to him. He was surrounded by insanity. They saw in Odyssian a murderer, a monster. Distracted by his own turmoil, he almost did not notice a subtle motion by Tiberius. The headman's words returned to him. Archers, those who had once been his friends, would rather kill him than understand his predicament. "No!" Odyssian cried out. "No!" The ground shook. People toppled over. Something whistled past his ear. As the tremor overtook Sarum, a hand pulled Odyssian away. It was not Mendel's, however, but Lilia's. "This is our only chance. Come!" Unable and unwilling to think anymore, he allowed her to guide him out of the village. Although those around them seemed unable to keep their footing, neither the farmer nor the noblewoman had any difficulty. Someone shouted his name. Despite Lilia's tugging, Odyssian looked back and saw Mendel on all fours. His brother was trying to follow, but suffered the same trouble as the rest of Sarum. Ignoring Lilia's protest, he went back for Mendel. Mendel took his hand, and suddenly found his footing. Holding tight, Odyssian led his brother from the chaos. "Horses!" Mendel shouted above the din. "We need horses!" Odyssian was about to argue that they had no time to secure even one animal, let alone 5, when suddenly a horse raced ahead of them. It was followed by several more, all bearing the saddles of the Cathedral of Light. They raced directly into the woods, and straight into the waiting hands of Achilleos. Skilled in dealing with animals, the hunter easily brought under control 3. Cerinthia managed to catch another, but let a 5th escape. Odyssian paused before the hunter, the 2 lifelong friends reading into each other's gazes. "We must be away from here," Achilleos finally said, thrusting the reins of 2 horses toward the farmer. "Away until they come to their senses." But both men knew that such a thing would never happen. Achilleos and Cerinthia could return, yes, and would, if the farmer had his way. However, Odyssian, and by fault of blood Mendel, were likely saying goodbye to their home forever. "We've only 4 mounts," the trader's daughter gasped. "Odyssian, you and I could—" "I shall ride with you, Odyssian," interjected Lilia. "She is welcome to the other horse." Cerinthia looked ready to argue, but Odyssian, reacting to the noblewoman's words, had already returned 1 set of reins. Achilleos quickly handed them to Mendel, who eyed the reins as if they had turned into serpents. "Mount up," urged the archer. "The tremor seems to be subsiding." Sure enough, all was slowly quieting in Sarum. Odyssian wondered if the tremor would renew its throes if he willed it so, then cursed himself for even thinking of such a thing. Whether or not he was somehow responsible, enough people had already been harmed or even slain due to events. To wish for something that might endanger others further was to him nearly as terrible as the crimes to which he had been accused. He glanced around at the few who had stood by him. Of all of them, Cerinthia was the most innocent. Surely, she at least could return now rather than later. "Sari, go back to the village. No one likely saw you. Go back to your father and brothers." She gave him a defiant look. "Not until I know that you're safe." To Odyssian's surprise, Achilleos added his support to her rather than to his friend. "She should ride with us for a time until things are settled. Now, no more talk." "To the southeast," Lilia declared without warning. "Ride to the southeast. We'll be safest there." Unfamiliar with that region, Odyssian looked at the hunter, but Achilleos only shrugged. He had not been much farther from Sarum than his companions. Lilia leaned near Odyssian's ear, her breath warm and stimulating. "Trust me," she whispered. "The southeast." "To the southeast, then," he growled to the others, "and away from this madness." With the noblewoman's arms locked around his waist and her soft head against his back, Odyssian Oldiamet urged his mount on. Behind him came the others, Achilleos taking up the rear. It would all resolve itself, the farmer insisted in his mind. It would all resolve itself. Somehow, sense would be made of everything, and he would be able to begin his life again, albeit probably not anywhere near Sarum. The ties he had with other villages had been cut forever. He could never trust them again, just as they could never trust him. The accusations and the memories would always lurk in the background. But Odyssian could start somewhere else, forgetting all that had happened in Sarum. A farmer only needed a good patch of land and a strong hand. He had both. He could build a new home and, just perhaps, make it large enough for a family. Lilia had sacrificed much for him. She had to mean something to her. Whatever the difference in their bloodlines, together they would put behind their pasts and make a new future. If the cathedral and the temple let them, that is.